Hi, I'm Dr. Rob Silverman, Amazon bestselling author of Inside Out Health and host of Proven Health Alternatives. Today's guest, Dr. Austin Perlmutter, without question, shared some immense applicable takeaways for brain health. He discusses in full detail his new leading edge book called Brainwash. He delineates multiple ways on how to keep your brain healthy, how to avoid any kind of cognitive decline, and without question, some interesting insights to overall health in America today. Enjoy this episode. Hey everybody, Dr. Rob Silverman here, Proven Health Alternatives. I've got Dr. Austin Perlmutter. Great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here.
So I'm going to do it right here. Here's his new book, Brainwash. I've read it twice. It is a great read. I strongly recommend it. Let's get right into it. What made you want to write this book?
Well, I went through the standard medical training model. I did my MD, and then I went to an internal medicine residency where I learned about chronic diseases, which are the principal causes of death in the United States and are also the principal healthcare cost in the United States. So these are the things that are killing people, that are making people have miserable lives in many cases. And what I learned from my training is that we do not have good ways of treating these diseases. And more importantly, we don't have good ways of preventing these diseases. So the top killers, these biggest problems, medical problems in the United States, we're not doing a very good job in stopping these from developing. And this was obviously difficult for me when I went into my clinic and I worked with my patients, because I wasn't really able to see that what we were doing was stemming the flow of these chronic ongoing conditions. And I happened to have an amazing resource in my life through my dad, David Perlmutter, who is a neurologist. And we would talk about these things all the time. We'd talk about, well, what are we doing for prevention? What isn't working? And over time in these conversations, we hit upon something really interesting, which is, why is it that despite all of our best efforts to tell patients what they need to do to prevent these conditions, and we do know what people need to do to prevent these conditions, it's largely eating healthier and exercising. It's not that complicated. Why was it that despite our best efforts at educating patients on these things, patients weren't following through? They weren't changing their diet. They weren't exercising more. They weren't making those lifestyle interventions that are absolutely essential in preventing chronic diseases. And that kind of led us through a variety of different questions. And those led to the question of, why do we make the decisions that we make? Why do we sometimes make good choices and other times make bad choices? And that's a complicated question. And it's something that people have kind of been struggling with for a while. But it turns out that a simple answer to that question is simply that our choices are a reflection of the wiring, the connectivity, the activation patterns of our brains. That when our brains are set up for good decisions, they make good decisions. And when they're set up for bad decisions, they make bad decisions. And as we started to put this together, we realized that there are interventions that each of us can make today that will help wire our brains for better choices. But on the other hand, there are things going on in our modern world that are doing the exact opposite, that are wiring our brains for poor choices, that are making it much harder for us to follow through on the things we care about. And so this book, Brainwash, was really about explaining how the modern world is wiring our brains for poor decisions, but also how each of us can start doing the opposite, wire our brains for better choices, and that we each have that power within us. And, you know, I've been talking about this for a while since this book came out, and actually beforehand, and I'm still just overwhelmed with how significant this concept is, that we each have to make a conscious choice, that is the choice here, to start wiring our brains for better decisions. And once we do that, we're going to start doing the things that we want to do, as opposed to the standard, which is to constantly be in a conflict with ourselves, with the person we want to be and the person we actually are as it relates to our choices.
Great point. I really want to dig into that. So our decision-making process, as you said, there's some things that damage it. Environment. What things in the environment would lead us down a path that we're going to make a poor decision?
Sure. Well, let's go to the most extreme example of this. So, what happens when the brain is damaged? We see this all the time in conditions like stroke, where there is a localized ischemic, let's say, stroke, where blood flow is cut off to a part of the brain, and that part of the brain could die. So, what happens when a person has a insult to that specific part of the brain is that we see specific patterns of changing in decisions. For example, when people have damage to, whether through a stroke or another area, or sorry, I should say through a stroke or something like a tumor or an external damage to the brain, in a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, they don't make the same good decisions. So what we know is that certain parts of the brain are essential in enabling us to make good decisions. And if you damage one of those parts of the brain through, again, a stroke, or let's say being hit on the head or having a tumor in that part of the brain, we don't make good choices. But what's so fundamental for listeners to understand is that it doesn't have to be some sort of, significant trauma to the head that causes this to happen, that we can have functional changes in our brain as a result of our environment. And those lead to the same patterns of decision-making changes. So what might those things be? Well, in the book, we talk about sleep deficit. And, we all talk about sleep as something that we do at the end of the day. Once we've gotten everything else done, it's not really a productive time. But we now understand that sleep is absolutely essential to our health, and it's absolutely essential in enabling us to make good decisions. So what we see is that when people don't get enough sleep, there's actually different activation patterns in the brain, and there's different connection patterns in the brain. And those translate into worse decisions. So to get technical here for a second, what we see is that two parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, have less connection when people don't get enough sleep. And this translates into increased emotional reactivity, meaning that when people don't get enough sleep, they're less likely to be able to have a cordial interaction with their boss, to be able to have a rational conversation with their spouse if things are going wrong. They're more likely to perhaps fly off the hook and to become upset, angry. So not getting enough sleep is very much something that has happened in the modern world as a consequence of our hustling lifestyle. And why does that matter? It translates into worse decision making. And we can talk about other aspects of the modern world that do the same thing. But the take home message is, by the way we interact with our environment, we are able to change the wiring and activation patterns of our brain. And that then translates into good or bad decisions.
Yeah, I mean, the sleep, I've seen a whole bunch of articles, and I know you've piggybacked on this also. Sleep is the missing link into our functional medicine world. It's where we detox and our brain shrinks. I know you're not trying to get too technical, but that's a great point. And I think as, medical doctor, I'm a chiro, we don't talk about sleep enough. I mean, you do, but the field don't talk about sleep enough. Well, we talked about some of the things that cause the problem. What's some of the solutions?
Sure. Well, right on the piggybacking on what you just said, it's getting enough sleep. And I do want to mention this thing that you just brought up, which is the the clearance system in the brain that activates at night. And this has been research over about the last 10 years, which has shown that as we sleep, we clear out the brain of all of the gunk that builds up, the metabolic waste that builds up during the daytime. And this clearance mechanism has actually been linked to improved cognition. Because one of the things that this clearance system takes out is actually amyloid, which is a plaque that builds up in patients who develop Alzheimer's disease. So what we actually see is that people who have trouble sleeping have a much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And it might be in part because they aren't getting that amazing clearance mechanism that occurs at night. So getting enough sleep, getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep, is a wonderful first step in helping people to improve really every aspect of their health. But as it relates to decisions, that's going to improve your decision making. What else is it that a person can do to improve decision making? Well, these are going to be things that you've heard about before. For example, exercise. We know it's good for the body. We know it's good for longevity. We know it's good for our heart health. We know it's good for our insulin problems. But it turns out that exercise activates the part of the brain that is responsible for helping us make good decisions, the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So exercise increases blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. And what we see is that after acute exercise, as well as after chronic exercise, exercising for months and years, people have improved decision making. They're able to bring to bear the part of the brain that enables them to weigh the pros and cons of choices, and that translates into better decision making. So as I see it, it's one thing to exercise for your general health, but if you're in a job that requires you to make good choices, if you're in a relationship that requires you to make good choices, what I'm trying to say is everything requires us to make good decisions. Exercise is an intervention to improve the quality of your choices. So that's another thing you can do. And then one of the most interesting parts of the research we did for this book was looking at how nature changes our brains. And a lot of people say, well, we know nature is good for us. How could it be bad to go outside and walk around in the trees? And I'm fully on board. It wasn't like I needed the science to tell me that I should go out and walk around in the mountains and chase waterfalls on the weekends. But as it relates to decision making, what science has shown us is that when we're out in nature, it kind of calms down the more reactive part of the brain, and it helps us to be more measured in our decision making. One of the studies that I presented the other week up at IHS had to do with how just 10 seconds of nature exposure was associated with improved decision making. That 10 seconds of looking at a picture of nature was associated with less impulsive choice, as opposed to looking at a picture of an urban environment. So that's such a practical thing that people can be doing, just trying to look at more nature, whether that's putting a photograph of nature in their home, in their office, or even bringing a plant into their home or office. That is such an easy intervention to allow us to make good decisions. And, we could talk about this for a long time, but I want to mention one more study that has to do with nature exposure. What researchers have shown us is that stress, cortisol, is linked to worse decision making, especially as it relates to chronic stress. That chronic stress disables our ability to access the prefrontal cortex and make good decisions. So that's why it's so important to note that researchers show 20 minutes of exposure to nature is sufficient to lower levels of cortisol. That is a really important take-home message. If you're somebody living in a city, you can get out to urban nature for 20 minutes once a week, and that will help to lower your levels of cortisol and thereby lower your levels of stress. So many ways that we can start applying the modern science to improve our decision-making and our quality of life.
Great takeaway on nature. Living in a city, we don't necessarily always take that into account. I think that everybody would benefit from that. But what a lot of people are going to want to know, and they're really going to want you to break down, is the exercise. Exercise for the brain. What kind of exercise? Are we talking about high-intensity interval training, steady state? Tabata, obviously, is an example of HIIT, etc. So let's go for it. I'm opening up the floor for you.
Well, so many people want to know the answer to your question, which is how much exercise do we actually need? Is it the 150 minutes that's recommended, 30 minutes, 5 days a week? Is it something different for brain health? And I think it's really hard to give a concrete answer to this question. And where I would start for anyone listening is the best exercise is the one that you do consistently. So I would much rather have somebody walk around the block a few times a week than go to the gym and exercise really hard and then decide that that's not right for them and go back to sitting on the couch. Movement is the key. And researchers have shown, at least as it relates to the improvements in executive function, that is the key thing that we're trying to incorporate here for decision making, is that it's aerobic, it's anaerobic. All of these things are associated with, so meaning you can get on the treadmill for a while, you can lift heavy weights in short increments, that all of these things are linked to improved cognitive function. My dad will talk about doing more aerobic exercise and more of the high intensity exercise because that's been associated with increases in BDNF, or brain derived neurotrophic factor, which is an important consideration. The reason for that being BDNF is what enables us to kind of create new connections between neurons. It enables us to solidify new neural connections. He calls it miracle grow for the brain. And when it comes to these interventions that I'm describing here to improve our decision making, it's one thing to do them a couple of times. It's another thing to solidify those pathways in the brain so that they become our habits. And for that, we really need that BDNF. So probably there's some evidence to suggest aerobic exercise is key in this whole process. But again, if listeners are trying to go to a take-home message here, I would say find the exercise that you are capable of doing and start there. Don't set your sights on something that is unattainable and then fault yourself when you're unable to follow through on that. As one other note here, I would say that as it pertains to improved decision making and specifically to improved executive functions, that's kind of the ability to use your prefrontal cortex to make good choices. Research has demonstrated that when you do exercise with other people, so when you're in community with exercise, that might actually improve the gains that we make. So it's a little challenging right now given the current viral scare in the country, but in general, trying to incorporate community in your exercise routine may actually be as significant as the amount of time that you spend doing this. So that might mean going for a walk with a friend. It might mean signing up for an exercise class. It might mean going to a meetup group where there's a communal hike around the forest near your town. So not that I gave a very clear answer here, but the bottom line is find the exercise plan that will work for you and build up from there. Don't start somewhere really high and then make that impossible to continue. And then try to incorporate community as you do your exercise. And those will be the two biggest things that will translate into these decision-making gains for the average person.
I think everything that you said was crystal clear in that. It's interesting when you spoke about community because we look at all the group fitness that's been underage the last 5 years. And that's fascinating. And BDNF, your dad did say that, nerves that fire together, work together, and, allows for brain neurogenesis. I actually learned that from him when he talked about that several years ago. So I think that the take home is let's get moving. America needs to move. And you're making a valid point. Let's move for brain health and better executive function. Before we get any deeper, I want to know what was the central idea of brainwash and what were some of the things that you were surprised to learn?
So the kind of genesis of brainwash stemmed from a question, which is why is it that despite having access to all of these foods, all of this technology, all of these interpersonal connections through the internet and in person if we wanted to, are people still so depressed, so anxious, and so unhealthy with these preventable diseases? It just doesn't make sense. There's this paradox that we have all of these things, and yet rates of depression appear to be going up, especially in our youth. Rates of anxiety are incredibly high, especially in our youth. Rates of suicide appear to be going up, especially in our youth. And these chronic diseases, which we know how to prevent, continue to make up as I said before, the principal costs and principal causes of death in the United States. And we wanted to look at this through, again, a new lens and to try to understand where we were going wrong. And that kind of led to trying to apply this decision-making problem to these issues, which is, it's not necessarily a question of knowing what it is to do. We all know what it is we should be doing, which is eating healthier food, getting outside once in a while, exercising, spending time with friends and family. It's that there's a gap between the knowledge or the information and action. And brainwash is, in essence, just a compilation of the best methods that we have seen to get you from information to action. The first part of the book describing kind of the roadblocks that have been set up to make it hard for us to be able to follow through on what we actually want to do. And the second half of the book describing the evidence-based methods we can use to bridge that gap and to start following through on the stuff that we care about.
Digital media. I got one of my things right here. Yours is probably
Yeah.
somewhere. I'm looking into a laptop. What about that effect on the brain?
Yeah, well, it's a popular topic right now, and I think people like to kind of go to the extreme here, which is that digital media bad, internet bad, social media bad, and if we could just get back to our Paleolithic era community, everything would be good again. And like anything, the truth is somewhere in between. It certainly isn't the case that digital media is universally bad for us. It certainly isn't the case that digital media is universally good for us. I think what is important to understand is that humans today are spending an unprecedented amount of time engaging with digital media. And that translates to about 4 hours per day for the average American adult watching TV, about 2 hours per day for the average American adult interfacing with smartphones. And then, depending on your job, there are some experts that would say that we're spending around 11 hours a day interfacing with digital media of one type or another. And again, that's not necessarily a problem, but it does create a question, which is, what is this doing to our quality of life? And clearly, we can see that as digital media has blown up and become such a major component in our day to day, people's quality of life, as far as depression, as far as anxiety, has not gotten better. And so there are these correlations that have been made between the use of digital technology and the increasing rates of suicide, anxiety, and depression. I don't think it's reasonable to hang our hats on that right now. I think that what is important is to understand how there are different patterns of digital media use and how some of them can be constructive and others are more destructive. For example, as it relates to our social media use, there are studies that show how if we're actively using social media, that means commenting on other people's posts, that means engaging with other people, people tend to have more well-being. On the other hand, people who are passively engaging with social media, that is kind of the lurking in the background type, where you're scrolling through and maybe making mental comparisons, but not necessarily interfacing or interacting with these other people, that's associated with lower quality of life. And so I think what digital media does to some extent is it just provides a mirror for behaviors that already existed, and it enables us to push closer to the extremes of those behaviors because it is promoting of silos. And that might be that it enables us to compare ourselves to others in an unhealthy way that leads to an extreme where we're no longer happy. It may also be that as it relates to our, let's say, political affiliations or our just general belief structures, we get put into these silos where we're and echo chambers of opinion and polarizing us against other people and making it harder for us to see their perspectives. Why is that a problem? Well, empathy turns out to be absolutely essential in enabling us to be happy, well-adjusted people and to enable us to work in concert with people across the world as opposed to wanting to go to war with them or judging them based on their skin color. So we really need this cognitive empathy, which is the ability for us to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And when we get put into these social media funnels that we are only engaging with people who share a similar and extreme viewpoint, it makes it much harder for us to engage in cognitive empathy. So to kind of summarize the point here, I feel that what digital media does is it kind of pushes people to extremes of what they maybe already had a tendency to experience, and that can be a problem. The other big point that I would make is when we're spending so much of our time interfacing with digital media, we are no longer doing the types of things that are associated with long-term health and happiness. So while we don't have the data yet to say what are the long-term health implications of, let's say, spending 2 hours a day on social media, spending 4 hours a day watching TV, what we do know is that there are positive health implications to getting outside, to spending time with people that we care about, to being more mindful in our interactions with the world, whether that's with our food or with other people. And that simply isn't happening when we're spending so much of our time engaging with digital media. Let me make one more point on this subject because I think it's important. There is a huge difference between watching a show, a Discovery Channel show, where you're learning about animals in the Amazon, and consuming the standard quality of media that is so popular on both the TV and computer-based streaming media sites. And what happens when we are taking in this media is perhaps more important than the actual media itself, meaning the content of the show, which certainly that Discovery Channel show is a lot better for our brain health than is reality TV. But in between, when we're being exposed to the advertisements, those are targeted pitches to change our our decisions, right? To get us to engage with and purchase these products. And people, I think, want to believe that it doesn't work, that advertisement doesn't change our preferences. But there's a reason that this has been and continues to be a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. All of these companies aren't spending this money because they think it's a good idea based on no evidence. It changes our opinions, it changes our perspectives. And as it relates to changing our opinions about food, about the things that we eat, what we know is that advertisements are preferentially targeting children to influence them to purchase and to eat unhealthy foods. And that these tend to be foods that are high in sugars, in unhealthy fats. These are ultra processed foods that will change their brains such that in the long run, they will continue to make poor food decisions. And I always hesitate to invoke the kind of meaning that comes with this term, but I think that's kind of unfair that we are allowing advertisers to change our children's brains such that they will become hooked on these unhealthy foods and these unhealthy products in general and set them up for a lifetime of chronic diseases and more poor decisions.
I got a lot of follow-up questions to those points.
Sure.
Those were stellar. So the first thing is, because we don't talk about it enough, and I thought you did a great job delineating it in that, how can we increase empathy in our lives?
Hmm. So let's start with what is empathy, because it's a term that is used a lot. And depending on where you look, there are at least two and potentially three types of empathy. The two main types of empathy that we talk about in our book are effective empathy, is the ability to kind of, if you were to, let's say, bump your toe, that'd be me feeling the, ooh, ouch. I'm experiencing a little bit of your pain. And the second type of empathy, as I've kind of described already, is this cognitive empathy. That's the ability to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. There's the third type, which is compassionate empathy, which is, I think the best way of describing it is the ability to kind of act on our concern for other people. So it's to put it into action. And as we talk about in the book, there is concern that our levels of empathy are decreasing. There was a study published by Dr. Sarah Conrath that showed that in college students, levels of empathy have dropped off by over 40% in the last couple of decades. And why does this matter? Well, I think that on a more personal level, we need empathy in order to be able to engage in healthy relationships with other people. It's as I've described before, it's kind of the glue that holds our relationships together. It's being able to say, "Oh, I hear what you're saying, and here's what I think about that." As opposed, "Okay, I didn't hear you. Here's what I believe." But on a much more planetary level, if you think about the possibilities as far as these global extinction events or these global events that would significantly diminish our population, I think about a couple of things. The first would be, let's say, a nuclear war, right? We have right now the arsenal that would enable us to destroy the entire world multiple times over. And I can't see the desire to launch nuclear weapons or to use a nuclear weapon as anything other than a empathy deficit, right? How do you consider the possibility of killing thousands, if not millions of people from any other perspective as a deficit of empathy? You don't care about those people enough. So that's one. And then the other thing is looking at the possibility of, or I should say, the inevitability of climate change if we continue on with our actions unchecked. Again, if we are using up resources and polluting the earth and creating these greenhouse gases at this current rate, we are preferentially damaging the life prospects for people who are in these less developed countries because they don't have the resources to be able to manage the rising sea level and rising temperature. So again, here we have a lack of empathy. If we're just thinking, I'm going to do whatever is necessary to improve this country's GDP, to improve my my stock options, and at the expense of whatever, let's pollute, let's create greenhouse gases, you're just not thinking about other people. So that's why, again, at a global level, having empathy is so imperative. And kind of the next question in this series is, okay, fine, but are we actually able to increase empathy, or is that a static measurement throughout the course of our lifespan? And it turns out that in the medical world, they've been looking at this question for several decades. The reason is we know that providers with more empathy get better patient outcomes. Surprise, surprise, patients seem to respond better to requests to take their medications if they think the doctor cares about them, right? Makes a lot of sense. So what we also know is that providers tend to lose empathy over the training, and that's why they've created these interventions to help providers to recapture that empathy. And they're really kind of straightforward. They can be as simple as trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, literally experimenting with cognitive empathy, thinking, how do I feel like the patient? They did a phenomenal experiment where they actually had medical students spend the night in a hospital so they got to see things from the perspective of a patient. But perhaps some of the more relevant stuff for the average person is mindfulness interventions tend to increase empathy as well. It's one of the reasons that in the book we talk about mindfulness and meditative practices as so important. Just being a little bit more mindful of how you're experiencing life, how other people are experiencing their lives. Those are interventions in empathy. And then one more I'll give listeners is gratitude tends to increase empathy. So something as simple as writing in a gratitude journal, or even just at the end of the day, thinking through what are 3 things that I'm grateful for today, that can help you to increase your empathy level.
One more follow up to what, those poignant points that you made before. Foods. So many people don't know what to eat. I know you have a whole section on foods and what to put together. So can you tell them what's good and bad?
Yeah, good and bad. Anybody who's watching this and listening to this right now probably knows about all these diet wars and how there's one camp that says you should never eat anything animal-based again, and the other camp says you should only eat animal-based foods. And some people say you have to be fully keto, and other people say you should be flexitarian. And there are all these people out there who are really certain that their dietary recommendations are the right ones. And my concern is that when all of these nutrition experts are battling each other over the specific macro and micronutrient contents of the ideal diet, the average person doesn't know what to eat. So in the absence of scientific consensus, I shouldn't say scientific, because I think the science is more or less in consensus with the general recommendations, but in the absence of expert consensus, the average person is going to do what is easiest. And what is easiest in the modern day is to eat ultra-processed junk food. That is what food has become. It is high in refined carbohydrates. It is high in ultra-processed fats. And it is high in these grain-fed or otherwise kind of distorted animal products. So that's my big concern, is that the average American is eating junk food as their principal food. And what is most important is to get them a couple of steps away from this basic standard American diet and towards something that we can agree is better for them. So as it relates to this, and as it relates to what we describe in the book, our goal is to help people to optimize for an easy to introduce diet that lowers inflammation. Because as listeners are likely well aware, inflammation is one of these cornerstone processes that is linked to the development of everything from heart disease to Alzheimer's disease. It's also, by the way, linked to poor decision making. Let me pause and say that again. Inflammation in your bloodstream is correlated with worse decision making. So this is why we thought it was so important to include recipes as well as a general dietary plan to lower inflammation. Because if you're able to lower inflammation, that should then allow you to make better decisions. And when you're making better decisions, then you're able to do things like exercise a bit. Then you're able to perhaps get off the couch and spend some time with people you care about. And then you develop a feed-forward cycle, pun intended, of course, to enable you to continue making good decisions. So what are the principal dietary recommendations that we would make for the average American to lower inflammation and improve the quality of what they're eating? In general, we recommend that you avoid ultra-processed foods. What does that mean? We're just going to go through the macronutrients. As it relates to carbohydrates, ultra-processed foods are anything that contains refined carbohydrates as well as added sugars, because added sugars are these kind of refined products of either beets or other plants that are then added back into foods, make them more palatable, to make them more delicious, but also to make them more addictive. And we know that that activates reward circuitry and makes it harder for us to stop eating these foods. 68% of foods in America contain added sugars. So when you are thinking about this macronutrient, which is carbohydrates, you need to be reading the label. You need to know, does this contain refined carbohydrates? And for the most part, you can tell if that's a white carbohydrate, if it's a bread, if it's a rice, those are stripped away of their nutrients. Those are refined carbohydrates. Okay, 2, for fats. What is it that we want to avoid when it comes to fats? Again, it's ultra processed food. So what are the fats that have been ultra processed? Well, these tend to be these vegetable oils that have been refined, pressed, and otherwise converted from a vegetable product into now what you see in the store, which is vegetable oil. And you can go through the specifics, things like canola oil, things like corn oil, but basically what you want to do is get those healthy oils that haven't been overprocessed. There really aren't that many of them that are considered by everyone to be good for you. But what I would recommend to people is you start cutting out basically any oil you're not sure of, and then instead start to incorporate the ones that are considered to be healthier, things like olive oil, things like coconut oil, things like oils coming from avocados, and healthy oils, fats that you can get from foods like nuts. I would say, as long as we're in the fats category, the opposite of the ultra processed foods, as it relates to fats, and the most anti-inflammatory fats seem to be these omega-3 fats that are preferentially found, at least in the most helpful versions, in fatty fishes. So this is, as I'm sure your listeners are aware, things like cod liver oil, things like salmon. These cold water fish tend to be wonderful sources of these anti-inflammatory healthy fats. And then finally, we get to proteins. And as it relates to proteins, there's a whole lot of conversation right now as to how much protein you should be eating. What should your sources of protein be? There's, again, debated, but I would say decent evidence that getting protein from plant-based sources tends to be associated with lower levels of inflammation and overall better health than more animal-based sources. And certainly that could be distorted by the overall quality of animal protein in the United States, which is very low. So as it relates to protein, your goal is to ask again, is this an ultra-processed protein form? The ultra-processed proteins that I worry about are those that come from animals that have had not only exposure to and have eaten all of the ultra-processed grains, but also have been raised in such a way that they've been given hormones, that they've been given antibiotics, and therefore have been exposed to a wide range of kind of chemicals that have altered them such that I now consider them an ultra-processed food. And if you do choose to eat animal proteins, if you do are trying to optimize proteins, I would say, first of all, plant-based protein is a wonderful place to start, but also of animal proteins, getting the grass-fed animal proteins, getting the wild fish, that's definitely your best bet as far as lowering inflammation and overall just trying to get a healthy diet.
And you do have that chapter on recipes in your book. And I know you know who he is, Jack Lalanne, the exercise guru. He actually was a chiropractor, believe it or not. Most people don't know it. He had a great line that really speaks to what you just said. And he said, if man makes it, I just won't eat it. Um, you spoke about inflammation a lot. So let's segue into, how does inflammation affect our brain and our brain health?
Sure. Let's start with the very basics of inflammation, because this is a term that is thrown around a lot and it's always demonized. But inflammation is not necessarily a bad thing. It's unregulated, unchecked inflammation over time that is a problem. And so acute inflammation, which is what you think about if I had a mosquito bite on my hand that was red and it was swollen, it was painful and it was warm, that's acute inflammation. That's the body's immune response to a threat. And that's probably helpful in most cases because it helps you to localize your immune response and fight off a pathogen and then heal from that. Now, chronic inflammation is really the thing that we worry about. And chronic inflammation is a state of ongoing low-level inflammation where the body's immune system is allowed to kind of go on unchecked. Now, that type of inflammation has been linked to, as I said before, everything from heart disease, the hardening of the coronary arteries, the increase in blood pressure, the increase in risk of stroke, to Alzheimer's disease. We know that inflammatory markers in the blood are predictive of long-term cognitive decline. But what's really important for listeners to understand is that we now understand inflammation has short-term changes or induces short-term changes in our thinking. So as I mentioned before, when you look at levels of inflammation in the bloodstream and you then look at people's decision making, you see that higher levels of inflammatory markers are linked to more short-term impulsive decision making. Really important to take that home. And when you look at kind of more long-term measures of inflammation, so this would be things like CRP, but also, interestingly enough, the marker hemoglobin A1C, which is commonly the diabetes marker, what we see is that those two markers are also associated with more impulsive decision-making. And, the question becomes, how does this actually occur? How does inflammation induce changes in the brain such that our decision-making becomes worse? And one of the central mechanisms that I believe, we're still learning about this, is actually through activation of the brain's microglial cells, which is the immune system in the brain, which can either be in a helpful anti-inflammatory form or a pro-inflammatory active form. And what seems to be the case is that when you have higher levels of inflammation in your bloodstream, systemic inflammation, that then activates your microglial cells such that they convert into the inflammatory form. And that then may be one of the reasons why our brain becomes biased towards worse decision making. I would also say that may be one of the reasons why inflammation in the bloodstream is so closely linked to the development of brain-based diseases like depression.
So if you could give a list of sources of inflammation, I think a summation of that so our listeners and watchers know what to avoid.
Sure. Well, I think the easiest ways to mitigate inflammation from the modern world are going to be to understand what is it that's going into your body and then how to make that better for your body. So where is inflammation interfacing with our bodies? Well, one that we've already mentioned is our food. When you are eating certain foods, you are either setting yourself up for inflammation or helping your body to fight chronic inflammation. Healthy foods tend to lower inflammation. Unhealthy foods over time are linked to higher levels of inflammation. So every time you take a bite, that is either pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. So that's one. The other thing that is critical to understand is that the way that we interface with our environment, the way that we take in information through our eyes and through our ears and even through our nose, these things then trigger responses in our body that can then over time lead to inflammation. So what do I mean by that? Well, perhaps one of the most widely talked about problems in the modern world is chronic stress. And chronic stress has its own range of associated health problems. But what we appreciate about this condition is that over time, chronic stress appears to induce inflammation. And that means that when we are exposing ourselves to chronic stress, either through our jobs or through our relationships, or even through our commute home, that might be increasing levels of inflammation in our bodies. So we really have to be aware of these sources of chronic stress and then both create strategies to lower our exposure to them, and I think have strategies to make it easier for us to manage them such that they don't convert into significant stress, right? So for example, meditation and mindfulness makes it easier for you to manage instances that otherwise might have made you very stressed. And then what are other sources of inflammation in the modern day? Well, one thing that I had written an article about recently is actually what comes in through our noses and through our mouths, and not food, but air. It turns out that the toxicity of air, or I should say air pollution, is linked to inflammation, is linked to degenerative diseases of the brain, and is linked to even changes in decision making. So it's something to keep in mind if you're going to be traveling somewhere that you can potentially avoid getting huge exposure to air pollution, or if you live somewhere, I lived in Portland for the last 4 years, which would intermittently have high levels of pollution through wildfire smoke, that you potentially try to limit your exposure to that smoke, install HEPA filters such that you're no longer going to be taking as much in when you're at home. So again, to kind of recap here, inflammation is the result of your body interfacing with the outside world. And, I guess I should say there is that whole other part of it, which is autoimmunity. That's an entirely different conversation. But the things that we know that we can mitigate would be inflammation that comes into our body in the form of our food, would be inflammation that comes into our body in the form of our relationships with the world around us. So through chronic stress is probably the best example. And then inflammation that comes into our body in the form of the air that we breathe. And I think that with those tools, people will get a much better hold over how this is coming into their bodies and be able to create strategies to limit that.
I would have to say that you have, without question, covered a lot about our environment and our outcome. We definitely should talk about that at a later date, environment and our effect on genes and things of that nature.
Mm.
I wanted to give you one question about the gut. I know we've talked about it multiple times, but for those who haven't heard it, talk about the gut's impact on inflammation of the brain and the gut-to-brain axis, if you would.
Yeah, well, as you and I spoke about earlier, if you think about how the environment impacts the body, we like to think, oh, well, when you eat the food, that's where the environment is coming in. But not exactly, right? If you think about where the interface between the environment and the inner system is most pronounced, it's the gut, right? That is our primary interface. And so then you think about how then is the environment through our gut influencing our internal state. And I like to think about this as the principal way in which we are capable of responding to our environment. We think, oh, well, what we see, what we hear, but there is so much more data coming into our bodies through our gut than any of those other organ systems. So let's imagine you have this amazingly large interface, which is the gut. And then you have the food that you're taking in, coming in through the mouth, transferring its way all the way down. Well, what happens when that food hits the gut? It interfaces with the gut cells and the microbiome. And so now you have trillions and trillions of cells, right? I mean, depending on who you listen to, the gut microbiome is thought to be several times more than the total amount of cells, or I should say that the bugs we have in us are several times more than the total amount of cells that we possess, or around the same. Either way, it's a ton of cells. Let's say around 30 trillion bacterial cells that we have in our bodies. So why does this matter so much? Well, when those food particles come in and are exposed to these enzymes and are exposed to the gut cells and are exposed to the microbes, they are transferring messages from the outside environment to our inner environment. And these messages can come through the form of hormones. They can come through the form of neurotransmitters, and they can also come through the form of specific microbiome related products like these volatile fatty acids, short chain fatty acids, that then produce effects throughout our body. So, as you and I have spoken about, one of the most interesting ideas here is how does that information from our food, from our microbiome, get to our brains? And it seems like one of the principal methods in which that information can reach the brains is through the vagus nerve. And that the vagus nerve has all of these projections that go into the gut, not quite into the actual through the gut lumen, but right outside of it. And that as all of these molecules that are either from the food itself or from the microbiome or from these gut cells communicate with these vagal nerve cells, they then go up the vagal nerve, which goes directly to the brain and tells the brain, here's what's going on in the world. Here's what we need to do differently. And that, to kind of tie all of this together with our previous conversation, how does that affect the brain? It might be through an activation of the microglial cells. So what we're saying here is that there is this beautiful communication pattern where our environment comes into our gut. It interfaces with our gut. It gives our gut messages. And those can be good messages or bad messages, that those messages are then transferred largely through nerves like the vagus nerve. And those messages go up to the brain and tells the brain, here's what's going on in the world, and here's how we should then change our behavior such that it can be ideally more adaptive in this environment. And I would say, that is a really unique double-edged sword, because if you have a dysbiosis or an overgrowth of the wrong type of bacteria in your microbiome, and you are producing inflammatory markers, as well as these bacterial products that induce inflammation, those messages are going up to your brain, and those messages might be changing your microglial cells, and that might be changing the way that you perceive the world by inducing, let's say, depression. So it's a very delicate balance here, and it makes it so important for us moving forward to think about what messages are we giving our microbiome, and how does that then translate into the way that we perceive the environment.
Yeah, there's such an argument about how many cells, and clearly the gut communicates with the brain. You did that so eloquently. One more quick question that I think a lot of people would want to know about: meditation, mindfulness. Great way to sort of close the pod webcast. How does that affect the brains, and how do they do it?
Sure. Well, I think at its most basic level, I look at mindfulness and really more meditation as a way to see what your operating system is up to. When you're going through the day to day and there are all these sights and sounds, it's really hard to have any processing of how it's actually affecting us. We're basically just always reacting. But if you sit, you have to be on some sort of a special mat, and it doesn't have to be cross-legged, and you don't have to chant Om. But if you just sit and close your eyes, allow thoughts to come, you will be shocked at how chaotic things are inside your head. This isn't some sort of a spiritual practice or anything like that. I'm just saying, if you look under the hood at how your brain is functioning through a meditation or mindfulness practice, you will be shocked at how much things are completely crazy. So why I like mindfulness and meditation so much is it gives you that insight, but it is also a wonderful way of helping you to reprogram your brain for more balanced thinking. And that then translates into doing a better job at work. That translates into having better relationships. It translates into less anxiety. I mean, these are the scientifically shown outcomes of doing these types of practices. And what's so remarkable about it is you see these outcomes with really short mindfulness and meditative interventions. So you could just pay attention to your breathing for 20 minutes a day. And over the course of 2 weeks, that is associated with substantial brain changes. And you can just close your eyes and practice being mindful for a couple of weeks. And that is associated with lower emotional reactivity. It's also been linked to lower anxiety. It's also been linked to lower levels of stress. So what I tell people is, if they're looking for a technique that will help them to think better, will help them to lower stress, will help them to lower anxiety, will help them to just do their interactions with other people, mindfulness and meditation are a wonderful way to start. And it doesn't have to be some sort of a complicated process. For the average person, I think about just paying attention to your breath for a couple of minutes a day is a phenomenal place to start. It's just like exercise. The point isn't to get to the gym for 3 hours and hit a certain level of incline on the treadmill. That might be right for you. But the point is movement when it comes to exercise. And the point as it relates to mindfulness and meditation is really just being a little bit more mindful in your day-to-day, which means paying attention to how you're experiencing things. It's not a whole ton of woo or anything like that. It's just a practical intervention that will enable the average person to gain a little bit more control over their thinking. And of course, the ripple effects of that are tremendous in every aspect of the day-to-day function.
Outstanding. So you did brainwash. You've been busy. You're helping the health situation in America. What's next for you?
My goal right now is to translate these ideas into better patient algorithms or better patient care, as well as to make them more accessible to the general public. Because I believe that we're at a place now with the crossroads of neuroscience, behavioral economics, habit formation, and just behavioral modification as a whole, where we finally have the tools to be able to help people to create long-standing, healthier behaviors, and that will then translate into higher quality of life. And as it stands right now, we are still operating at a model of behavioral change that is predicated upon two things. One is knowing why it's important for us to make changes, and the other thing is having enough willpower to follow through. And it hasn't worked. I don't know how much more evidence we need. It just doesn't work. And so now, by understanding how the brain is so critical in our decision-making process, how our environment changes the way that our brain functions, and how we can start becoming more in control of the messages we're giving through the microbiome, through the food we eat, through the sleep we get, that we can start governing the way that our brains function, we have an incredible chance now to help people to reach their goals and to get rid of this paradigm of blame that is the status quo for patient care, but also for the way that we look at our own failures in decision making. And I just think there's so much that we can do to remove that blame and start helping people to reach their goals.
Fantastic. So how can the listeners get in touch with you?
I have been directing people to the website for the book, which is brainwashbook.com. And I also have an Instagram that I'm on occasionally, and it's at Austin Perlmutter.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend. I've lifted it up a couple of times. Like I said, I read the book twice. It's a great read. It's an easy read. You're not going to want to put it down, and then you certainly won't be spending 4 hours a day watching TV. At least there'll be a couple of days where you'll read the book, which is great. This has been illuminating without question. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. We have to do it again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to do it again.
My pleasure. Dr. Rob Silverman, Proven Health Alternatives. Always yours in health.